Hello, Mark. Thanks for joining me on the podcast.
Good to be back. Good to see you again.
Yeah. So a lot has happened since our last podcast in the world, but also in terms of our friendship and you and I communicating pretty much like daily. You're quite the presence in my life now.
I'm honored, as you are in mine. You're always like giving me these little, like really cool insights, like one-liners, and it's sort of like, wow, what a perspective shift.
I appreciate that. But essentially, for our listeners who are tuning in to us for the first time, I did have Dr. Mark Cheng on the podcast 2 other times last year. And just taking a moment to share with our audience, like, it has just been such a journey. Like, basically, I reached out to you. I was like, let's podcast. It's another fellow martial artist. He's an SFG doctor guy. That would be great for some, traditional Chinese medicine talk. And we know a lot of the same people. And then, here we are almost a year later. And it's just like, wow, like literally we talk every day. And I think one of the things I wanted to point out is that after that Atlanta shooting, it was just so jarring on our entire community. But you were just so present and so thoughtful in just reaching out to me and just asking me how we're doing and how how I was doing personally. And it was super, I just super appreciated that. And I think that's kind of like where you went from like a podcast guest to literally like one of my closest friends within this last year. So we've had fried gator together, chocolate souffle, and definitely a lot of
Yeah.
laughs.
Oh my God. What was the curry dish that you
Oh,
prepared?
curry chicken. That's a staple, almost
Dude,
weekly thing I make in my home.
just like talk about melt in your mouth good. Like you were just so you're so nonchalant about like, yeah, it's just curry chicken, whatever. You were so like dismissive of it. And like when I smelled it, I was like losing my mind. It was so good. Like,
Yeah, it
oh, I
was.
just whipped this together. It's nothing. Dude.
It's funny because we often talk about food on this podcast, and of course I have Oscar on here all the time, and then we'll just talk about food for like an hour. But it is such an important part of like our household. And when I found out how much you enjoy food and sharing like your cooking and where you're eating and what's next, like that was, I mean, there's immediate like connectivity there too. I mean, who doesn't love food? So
And I suppose we should give a little shout out to Chicken Fire.
yes, yeah. Oh my gosh. Yes, yes, yes. And that was kind of a pandemic find, right? And so during the pandemic, there were so many places that closed, but there were also places that ended up kind of getting spotlighted. And of course, after the George Floyd murder, I was all about like, how can I support more Black owned businesses? What's out there? And there's these great food lists. And that was one of those startup, small in-house, like brick and mortar, what was it, food truck actually at the time. And yeah, and it's a Black owned company that just got their start with amazing freaking fried chicken. And I'm so glad you were able to partake of it.
Truly, they were amazing. So to Chicken Fire in Orlando, big shout out to you guys. You were amazing. All that and then some. For those of you guys who happen to kind of make your way through Orlando and want to make a pilgrimage to this place, like when you think chicken tender, you think about this little thing that like maybe takes up like half your palm. They have a chicken tender there that's like you're both of your hands put together. It is awesome. And for someone who like me is an absolute glutton, yeah, it was quite the experience. I left I'm drooling now as I talk about it. So if my enunciation goes south, you know where my mind is.
I know. It's so hard not to just like tangent on food. But it's actually, there was an actual reason that I wanted to talk to you today. And, one of the things in this very bleak world that brings me joy is watching the Olympics and watching the Olympic athlete, backstories and their journey and just seeing them just achieve and work so hard. Like as a very, very, humble martial artist that has done that my whole life, but in no way have I trained at an Olympic level. Like I just can so like feel their excitement, and I feel like I'm having success with them when they win, right? So I love the Olympics. Like I love to watch it, and it's so positive in my life. But lately, I've been getting frustrated, and Oscar's like, okay, you're going to need to reframe this or talk it out or something. I'm like, I know who I want to talk to. I want to talk to Dr. Mark Cheng, because one is you've trained Olympic athletes, and, you come from a medicine background, but a sports background and a martial arts background. And there's just so much there. But I have been so frustrated with just what has been happening, and over the last few years, of course, we've seen so much come out in terms of the treatment of athletes and what they've all been going through, and that it's not just a hardship journey of I work really hard, I succeed, I get a medal, but there's just so much more in the backstory to that. But so we'll get into that. But of course, I'm really frustrated, and I was wondering if you knew why Russia is still allowed to compete as ROC. Like I've been asking my friends this, like us casual Olympic watchers, like, why are they even allowed to compete? How can this be? And it just seems like they're always allowed to bend the rules. And that of course will lead us into the figure skating thing. But do you have any insight into like how the politics of Olympics work, and what that is about? Yeah, I know. I just went on a whole
just
rant.
just a touch of insight. I can't really comment on this Olympic Games, but like the last Winter Games that I was participating at, Russia was also involved in another doping scandal. And if I recall correctly, there was a ban. So like the anti-doping agency was like, there's such rampant doping on the part of the athletes from Russia that we will ban them. So Russia will not be allowed to compete in the Winter Games. So the work, evidently the loophole I could be incorrect in this. So if I am, please, those of your listeners who know better, please clue me in on this. But from what I recall, the workaround was that there was a loophole saying that like, okay, these athletes cannot compete on behalf of Russia, or Russia cannot field a team. But there were athletes from the Russian republics that I can't remember what the acronym was that they used like last Winter Games, but I don't recall it being ROC, especially since ROC in my mind stands out for me as Republic of China,
Right.
which would be Taiwan. So I don't know what's going on about this year, but last Winter Games, the workaround was that athletes competed on as like another blanket term. So it's basically like a rebranded Russia. So it's like we're winning these medals, and it's not for Russia, but we're from Russia. So
I
like,
know it's so frustrating. Yeah. So like Russian Olympic Committee or whatever, it's like they don't get their anthem played, or they're not allowed to have like the flag and all of that. But it's like the word Russia is actually still in their committee name. So it just doesn't make any sense to me. And I'm a bit of a stickler for rules, and I'm a bit of a like, there must be justice kind of thing. So it's just been very frustrating to watch. And on one hand, as a performer, as an athlete, as a martial artist, I feel for these athletes that have trained their whole lives, that have put time in. I am not saying that, down with all of the athletes. There's clearly a lot more at play here. And, way a lot of these countries run their programs are, I mean, Oscar and I kind of kid, but not really, that, some of these athletes from certain countries, their families are literally like being held as ransom. Like they will not eat for a month if you do not do well. And it's kind of, we joke, but I feel like there's a little bit of truth to that. And so
there
in
is.
no way, yeah. And in no way do I feel like it's all just, like the athletes should be totally penalized, and they should be, stripped of everything. It's frustrating because I feel for them, because they are hardworking and they are amazing and they've achieved so much. But it's kind of like, gosh, why they always got to cheat, right? Like we're looking at this incredible 15-year-old skater, Kamila, and
Mhm.
she's incredible. And so why does she need to have, these performance enhancing drugs? Like she's already incredible. And it's like, let her shine with that, with her own merits, without all of these other things. And I don't know how this works. Like a test is taken in December, but we don't find out until February 8th what's
Mhm.
happening. And then now they again very strategically, she's 15, right? So she's under the 16-year-old thing. And of course, she skates today and she's in the lead for the short program. And again, it's not all on her, right? Like she's done her part. She's a hardworking athlete, but at the same time, if she's old enough to be an Olympic athlete and she's old enough to be in the games, I really feel like she should be taking responsibility for, for she should be penalized. Like there should be consequences for it. And I cannot understand what has just happened here. And of course we'll get
Yeah.
into the double standard with Richardson.
Yeah, that it's a very difficult situation. Like, to speak to your what you said earlier about why do these athletes do these kinds of things? Like, when they're so gifted already, when they're so talented already.
Mm-hmm.
I remember one of the first days that I got to sit in the oval at in Salt Lake, where the skaters were training before the last games, and the coach came up into the stands. The short track coach at the time, Coach Anthony Bartel, came up to sit with me in the stands, and he goes, "Hey man, what do you notice about this?" He goes, "Do you know anything about skating?" I was like, "I don't know a damn thing about skating. Be completely honest. So just clue me in as if I'm like never set foot, never watched this before." And we just watched a race. And he goes, "What's the difference? What difference did you perceive between first place and fourth place?" And like I'm trying to play back in my mind, like some sort of like, was there some sort of technical difference? Was there some sort of biomechanical difference? I'm trying to like recall, like what did one person do to be in first place and one person do so differently that they're not even in medal contention.
Mm-hmm.
And he waited and waited and waited, and he goes, "You're thinking about this all wrong." He goes, "I can see where you're trying to go." He goes, "Look up at the score at the roster as far as the times, the scoreboard."
Yeah.
And the difference literally was 300ths of a second.
Mm-hmm.
So when you think about that, like the difference between gold medal and first not even placing
Yeah.
being 300ths of a second, like people will do almost anything to
Mm-hmm.
tip the scales in their favor of that 300ths of a second. And so like when you imagine people coming from, or athletes coming from situations of total poverty, of being like raised in war-torn places, or issues like that, where you may be training your whole life and wondering where your next meal is coming from, or you can be like living out more of your life as a celebrity in Moscow. It's not too difficult to see that desperation will lead people to have more and more questionable ethics.
Mm-hmm.
And same thing regardless of sport. So that's one point. And then the second point is like to level off the fairness thing. I spoke to one American athlete, and I remember I'm still in touch with this guy to this day, and he's cool. It was very very cool to have the chance to work with him. And I said, "Man, this is really frustrating. These Russian athletes still get to like some of them may be doping, some of them may not be doping, whatever. But like, let's just assume that the vast majority of them are." And he looked at me. He goes, "They are." He goes, There's no doubt." So I go, like, dude, how do you deal with that? Like, what goes through your head as far as that? He goes, "Screw it. I'm just going to be that much better." And so, wow, like when I heard that, like his whole thing was like, let them do whatever. I'm going to work
Mm-hmm.
that much harder. I'm going to be that much better. That gave me a whole new level of respect for him.
Yeah. And kudos to him. And 100%, like we always want to try to take that high road and be that athlete and take that path. But I just feel like, or do you feel like the fact that we know a lot of these athletes are doping, that they're using performance enhancement and then still being allowed to compete so openly now, right? So it's like one thing where we don't know what happened in the past before the tests were so clear and the science was up to date. And I may be speaking out of turn. I have no idea what I'm saying there, but I'm just saying like we clearly know now. Like it's 100% like this test was taken. This is what's happening. It's like, does that then diminish like for what previous Olympic champs have done? Like, does it put like, does it cast this like shadow over the fact that all these athletes did it the right way and the proper way, and that it doesn't even seem to matter at this point now? I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't matter because they're going to investigate it. They've made a, news about it, whatever. But I mean, she's allowed to compete. So it just feels like, I feel like if I were one of those athletes, I'd be pretty pissed off. And I mean, I can't put words into their mouths, but I mean, does this then moving forward change the perception for other athletes? Like, well, maybe it's not wrong, or maybe I should be doing that. Because like you said, some of them will rise above and say, I'm going to be that much better. They can dope all they want, but I'm going to be that athlete. But, or does it like cast a shadow and make people question whether maybe it's fine or not fine? You know what I mean? Like, does it change the ethical code of being an Olympic athlete?
I think a lot of it, I mean, to change the ethical code of the Olympic athlete in an ideal sense, no. Based on what I've read, based on the Olympians that I've had the privilege of working with, no. The people that are committed to doing it the quote unquote right way, doing it in adherence to the Olympic spirit, and have that soul of fair play, will stay with that. But there are those who are still going to be like, by any means necessary. And for them, I think context is king. For the people that are super desperate, who are coming from situations where like this is their only chance out, or their only chance for a quote unquote better life, or their only chance to mm, change their circumstance in life, or change the circumstance of their family in life, uh they're a little bit more willing to gamble.
Yeah. And I want to bring up, because it was something that you and I off air have like expressed anger about, frustration about. I retweeted Sha'Carri Richardson's double standard feeling, and how she wasn't allowed to compete, and she wasn't taking a performance enhancing drug, but by the rules of whatever committee, the Olympic Committee or the US committee, whatever governing rule maker that says, you can't have marijuana in your system or anything like that. And she was clearly doing so out of the, depression, coping with loss. Very different thing, because it's not a performance enhancing drug, as a matter of fact. But I
Right.
mean, she did break the rules, and by those rules, she was not allowed to compete. And, as a Black woman in America, as an African American woman, I'm sure she's feeling very beyond frustrated right now, right? And seeing that this has played out a different way so publicly on an international stage for somebody who, it's like a double standard. I mean, what are your thoughts there?
Rightfully so. I mean, I'm 110% behind everything that Sha'Carri's had to say. I mean, some of the rules that are still in play, as far as with the IOC, and certainly other governing bodies, or other government agencies, I think, regarding the use of cannabis, or using cannabis derived products, I think are quite outdated. Certainly we need to also update our understanding of cannabis, because there's so many different strains and they have so many different effects. Because some of those effects will dial you in a little bit better and allow you to concentrate a little bit better,
Okay.
versus others that will like allow you to just relax, unwind, and have the munchies. A little bit of a different thing.
Yeah.
So because we have so many different strains available, I think it's important for us to be able to differentiate and contextualize. Like, okay,
Yeah.
this person was taking these strains and it had this sort of effect. But by and large, I think if we're going to legalize something on as wide a scale as we've legalized um, the use of CBD and things like that, and other derivatives of the marijuana plant, of the cannabis plant, I think it's very important for us to kind of lobby for that, or push for that legalization, or push for that in across sports. Now, it's funny because I think it was the New York Post that, like, the day after the Super Bowl, right, made this headline like Snoop Dogg was smoking a joint right before his Super Bowl, and everyone had the same reaction. It was like, where have you been for the past like 30
And
years? Like,
yeah.
and what? Like, one, Snoop's name is synonymous with getting high. That's one. Two, like, California, in the state of California, the use of marijuana has been legalized. So
Right.
like where the issue is, like uh, I think because there's so many people, at least in the States, who still
Mhm.
feel that any usage of marijuana products or cannabis products is illegal, unethical, evil, whatever. Like there's a lot of education and perception that needs to be retinkered.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is its own conversation in itself because I certainly am not an expert in that area. Although I am part Jamaican, culturally, I have been to a marijuana farm in Jamaica, as a matter of fact. That
Wow.
was really amazing because like the chemist, the scientist there was a next level on explaining, all of these things. And I was just there by circumstance. That's another story.
Uh-huh.
But
Uh-huh. Yeah.
yeah,
Uh-huh.
I don't smoke marijuana. I've never have ever, but I found it fascinating. And when the opportunity arose, like, do you want to go to this farm? I'm like, yes. It was so cool because you think about these farms and here in the States you imagine, okay, they've got the greenhouses and there's all this stuff, or even somewhere like Jamaica, you would imagine it to be like kind of like a field. It was on the freaking side of a mountain. So like you had to go down the stairs like on the edge of a cliff. And so it was
Wow.
like, and that's not what I had imagined. So I was like, oh, this is breaking like stereotypes and perceptions in my mind of what I had preconceived notions of what that would be. And of course also just even talking to the people who are running this thing, and the fact that it is very scientific, right? It's not just a bunch of guys like just half baked all the time and just like rolling up joints, but like it's a very scientific process, and I am in no way knowledgeable about that. But I think you're right. Like everything else in this country and culture, education is key. And the fact that we don't have enough of the right or correct or mainstream information coming out on so many of these things is the big problem, right? So we just go off of what we think we know, and then what we've heard, or what the one headline we read, and then if it's on the internet, it's real, right?
Yeah, I think a lot of this stuff in how public perception plays out, like reductionism is probably one of the greatest social evils or social diseases that we've got
Mhm.
afflicting us right now. So like like people that say, oh, anything that comes from the marijuana plant or the cannabis plant is evil, blah 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 blah. Like what about hemp hearts or hemp seeds that have become part of food that are now a protein source? What about CBD oils? What about things like that? And it like for the people that are still in that old, I don't know if you remember that old black and white um, film that used to come out called Reefer Madness that was like used to generate so much paranoia about the use of marijuana.
Okay.
We need to so move past that. Like
Right.
I'm a big proponent of being able to understand like here are certain medicines, how do we use them? So for
Yeah.
example, like in Chinese herbal medicine, 活马人 is the cannabis seed. So
Mhm.
we use that in Chinese medicine. That is a part of our pharmacopoeia. But like if if we're trying to practice Chinese herbal medicine in a place where the rules of, or the laws of that locale forbid the use of a certain product or um, whatever the item is, then it hamstrings our ability to be able to help our patients. So much in the same way as ephedra, like ma huang was used, for thousands of years by Chinese herbal ephedra, herba ephedra,
Mhm.
um, to treat respiratory ailments. But once Western athletes started abusing it for, sports performance, which is not one of the indications of ephedra, then we also got punished. So I think, again, context needs to be king. We need to be able to say like, okay, these companies should not be able to use this, but everyone else that's been using this responsibly, you guys can continue to. Similarly with marijuana, cannabis related products. I think the same thing needs to be done. Like painting all cannabis products with the same broad brush does everyone such a disservice.
Yeah. Yeah. And obviously, um, on an international scale that's coming through. I mean, I feel right now for, Shikari and what what she must be feeling. Like I can't even imagine, right? Like to have trained your whole life for something and then to have gone through trauma and then to have been just basically tossed aside and then now seeing that other people can just do whatever and it doesn't, I mean, I know it's not as nuanced as that, but like it just doesn't seem to matter. It's just and unfortunately that's just what it is, right? It's never fair. And Russia doesn't play fair. Clearly, like this is not the first time. You're like, oh, this is kind of round two of this, and I'm like, when are we going to catch up with the fact that something needs to change? And it was it surprising to you that the committee made this decision to kind of allow her, or did you figure that they were going to allow her to skate?
Um, Again, I didn't really know enough about the whole backstory behind
Mhm,
her story, behind why she was allowed to skate. But
mhm.
if there was a loophole saying that, like, okay, under a certain age, there's no
Yeah, they basically
responsibility, then
said under 16, you are a minor in this world, and also that your mind is not so developed yet to where you understand or know, even if someone else is giving you this is drug and things like that. Also, the reason they ruled it as okay was they said it would do her so much damage because she's already competed, we're already in the Olympics, like, to not allow her to compete would the effects that it would have on her at her age would be so horrible, you know? And, I mean, you're seeing athletes coming out like left and right as commentators, you know, Tara, who was 15 when she won and all of that was like, "Yeah, I get it. I get what it's like to be a minor competing in the pressure, but I also did it cleanly," you know? And so
Mhm.
you're hearing a resounding, you know, all these stories of other athletes that have been a certain age. And then that raises the question, should there be a certain age then to compete? If you're not competent enough as an athlete to take your own health in your own hands, should you be at that level at that age? You know, like that's a whole nother, I have no idea. I mean, you've worked with athletes. Do you think that age does equal like that maturity in entering that kind of, it's a circus, right? I
No, I'm
mean,
going to say no. I'm going to say no because there are
okay.
certain athletes. Again, it's very individual. There are
By
certain
the
athletes
sport,
who,
right?
right? I mean,
Right,
not just
because
by the
like
sport,
women's
but also.
gymnastics, you're 13, you're in women's gymnastics.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, like I think that a lot of those boundaries vary from sport to sport, and rightfully so. But
Mhm.
I think the IOC, I'm not sure if the IOC does or does not rule out, like, okay, for this sport, we are not allowing athletes under this age. Um, and yeah, I'd love to know that. But yeah, that's something that's a little bit outside of my field of expertise.
Yeah.
I will say though that as far as maturity levels, you will see people of all ages in terms of athletes who may or may not be cognizant of the consequences. And I think that's an important word there, consequences. Like, what are the consequences for me making these decisions, or me taking these performance enhancing drugs, or me training this hard to the point where, like, whatever, right? So I think that's that's an individual thing, but I'd love to see standardization across the board.
Yeah, I mean, and like you said, that's very difficult, especially because for different sports, age kind of adds up. Like you don't see, you know, female gymnasts at 50. It's just like
Right.
physically, I mean, you do, but not at an Olympic game or something, right? And so it's really hard to do. But I just feel like then that also leads us to talk about coaching staff and mentorship and the people that they have in their corner, right? Like so you know, one of the frustrations that I've expressed over the last several years after hearing about all of the sexual abuse in the female gymnastics, you know, area, and just thinking like, where were the people who are supposed to protect them, right? Because you are going to have younger athletes, especially in some of these sports where it's a young person's game. Like you're not going to have, you know, full mature adults that are always, and even as an adult, you know, you can be a victim, but like just the abuse that was happening there, and just like the you know, the fact that I feel like a lot of that women's gymnastics was very corrupt, and people were covering things up. It was just, it's like the freaking Catholic Church, you know what I mean? I was like, what is happening here? And you and I have spoken off air, and I don't know what you are allowed to or not speak to, but the toxicity of the environment for a lot of these athletes. I mean, beyond just something as scandalous as that, I know that you've mentioned the just the fair treatment sometimes is not even there, even for US athletes, let alone some of these in these countries where like we joke about their parents being like, you know, held at gunpoint, but like even amongst our you know, our country that we have here, we see unfair treatment of athletes.
Sure. And I think I shared this vignette with you on one of my previous visits here to the podcast. When I was in China, um, teaching for FMS, I was really shocked at how like some of the coaches were like, why do we need to do this? Why do we need to take the functional movement screen? Because like this injury prevention, like if we're if the athletes don't perform, they don't perform, and then we just get a new athlete.
Right.
And that was the whole mindset. And
Crazy.
their whole thing was like, and I tried to explain to them several times, like, look, we're looking for asymmetries in movement so that like if we can address these asymmetries in movement, we'll hopefully improve the resilience of the athlete. So like instead of like, for example, driving around with one size tire on the left of the car and a totally different size tire on the right of the car, and then trying to race that car, we're actually like leveling out all four tires so that whether it's race day or whether it's just driving down the road, your car will handle in a productive, just consistent fashion.
Mhm.
And the looks I got were quite like very, very telling to me and very, very shocking to me. Like people looking at me, like coaches were looking at me like, why do we care? And I was like, what do you mean, why do we care? Like, we want to give the athlete the best possible chance so that they don't get injured. And their response, time and time again, was like, if the athlete gets injured, they can either have surgery or we'll just get another athlete. And I think when you come from a country there where there are so many people vying, and like their roster is that deep to where like they know they'll have tons and tons and tons and tons of athletes vying for every single spot, then the priorities are different. The analogy I gave was that my host at the time told me, you know, you Americans think about that, that high school experiment where you throw an egg out the window and like you are trying to figure out how to package it in such a way that like
Yeah.
when it hits the ground, the egg is so perfectly cradled and,
Yeah.
and
Yes.
cushioned and supported that it doesn't break. And I go, yeah, yeah, like I did that as a kid growing up.
Mhm.
Like I remember that doing that in middle school. And she goes, yeah, that's very American. And I go, what is that supposed to mean? And she goes, this is the Chinese solution. Like this is meaning mainland China. She goes, our version of that is we have a room full of eggs, a whole room full of eggs. So we'll take a box full of eggs and pitch the whole damn box out the second floor. Now, a lot of those eggs will break, but a whole lot of those eggs won't break. So we'll just take the ones that didn't break. And I was just like, wow, that is like,
It's very
I,
Spartan.
yeah, I mean, as far as someone for me who was born and raised here in the States, it was very
Yeah.
hard for me to realize, to rationalize that or to contextualize that.
Mhm.
But then, like, when you think about how many billion people are in
Yeah.
China
Yeah.
and how many different ethnic groups are within China and how they've actually been, at one point conquered to kind of fit under the umbrella of the People's Republic, it's a little bit more understandable.
Yeah, it's just such a different culture. Like it's literally billions of people, and people always say, "Oh, Chinese tourists are the worst because they're so rude and they push their way around." I'm like, "Well, when you're in China, because I've been there, and you try to be nice and hold the door open for someone, you'll never go through that door because a billion people are coming your way, and you can't actually be as courteous. It's just a little different, right? The culture is different, but at the same time, I still feel that there's no excuse, even if there's billions of people and you see them as dispensable, to have that lack of care for human life, right? So as a stunt performer, I worked with Hong Kong stunt performers and stunt coordinators, and they would be like, well, it doesn't matter, there's like 100 stunt guys waiting outside, so if this guy breaks his arm, there's another guy, and I think that disregard for us as a fellow human is absolutely abhorrent. Like I understand that, yeah, there are other people you may be dispensable in that regard, but I just feel like that lack of care is problematic. And I don't know that that's ever going to really change over there, but I mean here in the States, I feel like there is, not to that degree, but it comes upon where if you're not Nathan Chen or Michael Phelps or Simone Biles, and even I mean, even the athletes that are regarded so high are abused in some way, right? And
Yes,
so I'm curious about the athletes that come in 15th all the time, but are still, compared to any other human, an Olympian, right? Like, even like if you're coming in 15th, you don't get the accolades and you don't maybe get the protection or the sponsorship and stuff. Like, what is it like for those athletes? Because I know, again, you've worked with so many
hellish.
people. It's got to be, even in our culture, where we would be like, oh, we would never be like that. But I don't know. I feel like we take our athletes for granted as well, and the ones that aren't on the podium every time, I'm curious what their experience is like, or if you have any preview to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think for certain sports where there's like a high marquee value where like everyone's going to tune into it, like people around the world are going to tune into it, so there are going to be more eyes on it. There's going to be more sponsorship. And when there's more sponsorships, those athletes generally are a little bit more well taken care of.
Mm.
In a country like the Netherlands, where speed skating is a thing, like those athletes are super well taken care of, even though it's a tiny country. Whereas here in the States, like a sport like speed skating, I'll comment on speed skating just because like I've had like the most public relationship with them,
Yeah.
having been to the 2018 Winter Games with them. I've worked with other Olympians, but like I'll comment on speed skating just because like it's not a real secret that I've worked with them. Um, in the US, because speed skaters aren't, or speed skating isn't like considered as mainstream of a sport as, let's say, football, basketball, baseball, um, or even soccer, because they don't have that much viewership. Most corporations aren't as eager to dump sponsorship dollars towards them. So for example, I remember there was one athlete, um, national team member, super talented kid, wicked hard worker, like one of the most humble attitudes I've ever met, and just not only an awesome human being, but truly a world-class athlete. I mean, I have nothing but respect for him. He was working, if I recall correctly, three jobs, three jobs while training for the, to hopefully qualify for the US team as an Olympian. Um, dude, like to work one job and train that hard is already something. To work three, uh, man, I remember I was just dumbfounded when he told me. I just like my jaw was on the floor. I'm thinking like, how the hell does this kid recover?
Yeah.
And the obvious answer to that is he
They
doesn't.
don't. Yeah.
He doesn't. So, I mean, like, no matter how cush of a job you have, like maybe it's just like you're sitting in a chair, you're hanging out at the register, and but you're there for a shift. That's a shift where your body is locked in that position. You've got to do these things, and maybe it's not the most physically laborious, maybe it's not the most like mentally intensive, but it's not rest, it's not recovery. So I think when you compare that to how I've heard some athletes, like, or I was told from some other athletes from other countries, like they're athletes who are coming from much less loaded or wealthy countries, and how those athletes were treated during their time preparing for the games was totally different.
Mm.
So like those athletes were treated like, okay, you need to train, you need to rest. Don't worry about anything else because you're representing our country. Whereas in the States, like depending on the sport again. This one particular athlete that I have in mind, like it was sort of like you get to train super hard for the privilege of representing our country, and it's like, mm, okay, it is a privilege to represent the country. There's no two ways about that. However, it would be really cool if the country, like the quote unquote greatest country on earth, would actually show some meaningful support.
Mm. Yeah. And it's frustrating to hear, and heartbreaking actually to hear those stories. I'm curious, since you've worked with so many different types of athletes, from casual, I just want to stay in shape, humans, to Olympic level. Like, what is that differentiating characteristic between, or even like a pretty serious practitioner to Olympian? Because I just feel like that jump is just again, like I consider myself kind of all in full time with what I do, but I in no way, I feel like they're just like literally like superhumans. And I have so much respect for them. Like, what do you think really separates them from kind of the rest, and how you are the one that goes on to make the teams and things like that? Like, what do you feel like that, that characteristic is that differentiates them?
A lot of it is circumstance. Like, for example, especially if you're working in a situation where you have to be the one organizing a club, you have to be the one managing the business of the club, you have to be taking care of getting the uniforms, you have to contact the parents, you have to like, and do all of the back office work. All of that takes up bandwidth, and that's bandwidth that could be applied towards your own training, could be applied towards your own recovery, could be applied towards like upping your performance levels. So those little things, those seemingly little things, do add up as load, and they take away, they detract away from us, I think, in a lot of ways, truly expressing our potential. Like, if you have the kind of infrastructure in your sport and in your athlete development programs to be able to create an environment such that those youth athletes can then come up, or then like be first be identified, and then be like nurtured in such a way where like they can really express their max potential. That's like comparing the real apples to oranges. Like, for example, you not only had to learn the system, but you had to teach the system, you had to do the outreach, you had to you rep it. There's a lot of different pressures there. So like, if you, Mimi Chan, grew up in mainland China and you wanted to, let's say, grow up as a wushu athlete, right? It would have been pretty different for you.
Yeah. Lots would be different if I actually grew up in China. My Mandarin would
Yeah.
be better for one, but no. But I just find it fascinating. Like I said, I think I'm just so in awe. And one of the things that does resonate when watching all of these Olympians, and they're very, they always show the highlights and their story, is the support that they had, right? So they're usually shouting out to their parent figures or their coach or whoever it was that supported that journey. Because it's true, if you've got someone nurturing you throughout this process where you have to think of nothing else but being on the ice, or nothing else but being in the ring, or running the track, or whatever it is, like that's what you get to eat, sleep, and think about, and have someone having food there ready for you. Like, all of that adds up, and it's so clear when all the athletes talk about it. Like, usually it's their parent, right, that's just given up everything so that they can do these amazing things. I'm always amazed with someone like Erin Jackson, who I know she was like an inline skater, but it was like, oh, I only started ice skating 5 years ago.
That's
I
true. That's true.
freaking lost my shit when I saw that. I was like, what? And
Aaron is
now,
a badass.
here she is with the gold, and I'm all like, oh, like, Florida, something positive coming out of Florida. You don't know how much I've been really like rooting for her.
I can
It's
only imagine. I mean, like,
amazing to me.
when I met her uh in Utah, pre like the last games,
Yeah.
every single person that when they were talking about her was like,
Yeah.
watch her, just
Really.
watch her. Because when I'd met her, she just kind of started like on the ice, and she would still wobble, she was still like a little bit like, dough legs.
Uh,
And I just remember going like, wow, like,
she's at the Olympic training.
I she wasn't going to the games last year, but I just
Right.
remember looking at her going like, hmm, okay. And like,
Yeah.
everyone was so like, watch her. Everyone was so amped about her.
Wow.
And then proof positive. I mean, Brittany Bowe, who stepped back to allow
Yes.
Aaron a
Yes.
chance. Brittany, I gotta give her a hat tip too. Um, she stands out to me in so many ways. I had the privilege of working with her also
Mhm.
before the last games. But I mean, what an amazing human being and an athlete. One of the most principled people I've yet to meet, or
Well,
have
talk
ever met,
about a
I should
team
say.
player. I mean, redefining the words team player, right? I mean, this is just the whole thing was just so heartwarming to me. And this is the part of the Olympics that I want to experience all the time. This is the part of the Olympics that has me crying tears of joy for a change, instead of just being like pissed off all the time. And just getting to see them do their thing, and just the respect for it. But yeah, that whole thing, seeing Erin and then hearing that she just started ice skating not that long ago, was
Mhm.
unbelievable. I mean, that just clearly shows her athleticism. But yeah, just so much respect. So so as somebody who's like just kind of been in and out of that industry, in and out of that arena and everything, like what do you enjoy watching? It's the summer games or the winter games or both, or and what are your, or do you even watch the games? Like, be honest.
I gotta make a confession that, yeah, like unless I know athletes in a particular sport, I rarely ever watch sports. I mean, especially now because like I'm working such crazy hours, and
Yeah.
like whenever I do have any kind of shred of like functional brain cell going on, I try and spend that time either in my own training, my own learning, or with my kids or my folks.
Hmm.
So like, I mean, just yesterday, I remember, like, for example, I read a post and I made a comment on the post saying like, you know, what's the date for this thing? And the date was clearly marked in the post because like I thought I misread the post at saying a different date, like March 30th. And I was like, that's a Wednesday. How can this event be on a weekday? And so like I didn't want to clown at in the post, and the guy replied back like, it's right up there in the and then I reread it, and after I'd had a little bit more coffee, I'd reread it, and I was like looking at it and thinking like, it didn't say that date March 20th, which is weekend. It didn't say March 20th before, and like there was no editing to it. So I was like, wow, man, like I clearly need more sleep. Um, but that divergence aside, like these days, I really don't watch much sports unless I know certain athletes who are in that particular sport. I do try and look for highlights though of mostly the combat sports, just because that's what I'm like. I have a love for. So like
Of
in the
course.
summer games, judo, taekwondo,
Hmm.
boxing, fencing. So like
Yeah.
wrestling, I love love those.
Yeah. Yeah, I
Um,
see that. I see that. But well, don't worry, because I'll just text and keep you up to date and be like, so and so just won, so and so just fell, so and so, because I'm not sleeping because I just want to watch the Olympics all the time. And it's always on like late at night. And it's so frustrating when it's being held somewhere like Beijing and you're getting, all
sure,
these
and this
crazy
has been a
hours.
right, and this has been a super like I think I don't know what the word is, but like this particular Olympics has really, I think, captured my imagination in a lot of ways because
Mhm.
I've wanted to see what happens not only with the athletes that I got to work with last year, or last Olympics, um, but also like some of the athletes who back then were in youth development who are now like Olympians,
Yeah.
um, and also some of the other stories in there because like we have some really great athletes like Eileen Gu, like Zhu Yi, like Nathan Chen, like Chloe Kim, who are out there repping and who are doing great things. And like I feel so stoked for them. And you know, at the same time too, seeing how people are reacting to their successes or reacting to their challenges has been quite telling as well.
Hmm. Yeah, there's like a whole nother conversation there because I always try to understand. I'm watching um the sledding, the mono sledding, and I'm like, oh, okay, this person, is Canadian, but she's representing the USA now, and blah blah blah. And then Eileen is getting a lot of slack for repping China, and I just remember back in the day thinking about like the basketball players and how all of them would go back to their countries and then just represent their countries, and that was kind of a
Hmm.
normal thing. But now you just see so much like cross citizenship and people making decisions to compete on behalf of. What are your thoughts there?
I think we should allow the athletes to compete on behalf of like whoever. I mean, it's hard enough to be an Olympian, no matter where you are. I mean, never mind the Olympics, whether it's the World Games, whether it's the Commonwealth Games, whether it's like the all Southeast Asia Games, whatever the games are, right? Like regardless of that level of competition, it's so hard to break through. It's so hard to be a part of a national team that if you get the chance to compete at all and you have some kind of affiliation, do it. I know there are people out there who are like, oh, you were raised in the United States, you were this, you were that, you owe everything to the United States. I could see that kind of mindset, but I don't really subscribe to it. Similarly, like I think there are people out there that are just like, I don't know how to phrase this the most diplomatically, but I think there are some people out there that feel so disempowered that the only thing that they can do is just cast shade on somebody else as a means of like trying to feel like they can one up someone. Like the flack that Nathan Chen is getting from, you know, people on Weibo saying that like, oh, he doesn't speak Chinese well enough, he's this, he's that, he's not Chinese enough, whatever. I mean, dude, he's Nathan Chen. Like, you or whoever you are that are commenting on that stuff, but he's Nathan Chen. He's a household name. You are not. And so at the end of the day, like all the people that are casting shade at like Eileen Gu, at Nathan, at whomever, right? Like, cool, you do you, but like they're going to keep on being them. And hopefully, if their priorities are straight, if their perspectives are solid, they'll understand that a lot of these people that are talking so much smack about them really aren't the power players, really aren't the power holders. So, like, if that's their only means of feeling empowered, it's really kind of a demonstration of how, in some ways, spiritually poor they are.
Yeah, well said. And just because like it's something that I know that you and I through social media kind of shared some frustration about, I have to bring up, especially being in a climate where the last couple of years have been jarring for Asian Americans. As you well know, I'm dealing with just a slew of things with the Asian American community here in Florida, fighting for, some inclusion with our education system. And it's just been a constant battle. And it's finally a conversation that has been brought into the mainstream and not just something that's discussed privately amongst friends or in family or in smaller circles. It's finally a discussion that is nationwide, and I'm grateful for that, that we are able to have these discussions. But there's a resounding presence of Asian Americans in figure skating, and that was pointed out by the New York Times. And I had to comment, like I just couldn't help myself. I had to comment. And I like being questioned because Oscar will question me and say, well, why do you think that? Or why is that? And the word was overrepresented, right? They said Asians are overrepresented in American, in the US figure skating. And I lost it, and he asked me to explain. And so my explanation was just the use of the word, right? Like journalists, their freaking job is to write, and they should be intentional with their words, and they should know which ones to pick because that's their job as a journalist, in my opinion. I'm not a writer. I don't come up with the right vocabulary all the time, but I do know the word overrepresented was the wrong word to have used there, right? Because I said to Oscar, well, a lot of people on Twitter have made a really good point. Like, would you say Black Americans are overrepresented in the NFL or basketball? And he's like, well, they are dominant. I said, exactly. Okay, you could say they are highly or like very dominant or prevalent. Make that's a statement, right? That hey, a lot of Asian Americans are ice skaters. To say they're overrepresented, it implies one, that there shouldn't be that many of them. And then two, it even implies that Asian Americans aren't necessarily American, which is exactly what we've been trying to combat especially these last few years. And so, like you said, all these people like to point these things out, and I don't care about those social media trolls and those people who are not athletes and not doing anything and just sit there and criticize. But I feel the responsibility, and you as a journalist, as a writer, as somebody who knows what that means and when you're taken out of context, and I get it, and sometimes you make mistakes, and I'm not ready to just crucify everybody on what they say all the time, but especially in this climate, I thought it was super insensitive, and I was really upset. And I'm not a sensitive person. I'm not like, oh, you have to say everything just right all the time, but I was really irritated by that. So just thought I'd bring it up.
And I thought justifiably so. I mean, that headline pissed me off as well. Um, journalists, I mean, journalists, I think probably perhaps more so than almost anyone else in this country have a unique kind of power. And I think there's a disrespect or a disregard for that power. And that power is based on the sanctity of the written spoken word. Now, we as a society, I don't know for how many years now, have gotten into the phrase of like, oh yeah, same thing. No, it's not the same thing. Semantics matter. The word choices that we use matter. So like it becomes very easy to get dismissive and say, oh, you're overacting. Oh, you're doing this. Oh, you're doing that. As a shirk off, to just sort of say like, oh, just shirk off the responsibility for what we said or what we did or what we wrote. But the writer who put that out saying that like we're like we have some sort of excess, like an excess means that there is a problem, it's a
Yeah.
negative, right? To say a certain group is dominant, it sounds positive, there's a positive spin on it. If you're trying to communicate something that says like, okay, we have an excess of grain, we have an excess of food, we have an excess of this or that or the other, like usually that means that there's some sort of imbalance that needs to be just like somehow rectified. And so like if the person is trying to sound that sort of like dog whistle that they want less Asian Americans in whatever, or less of a particular group, like saying like, oh, there's like an excess of African Americans in the NFL. What kind of stupid shit? Like, I mean, to me, anyone that's going to play that game is inherently trying to be sneaky or underhanded or dishonest or unethical. And if they say, "Oh, well, I didn't mean it that way," like, yeah. I see the kind of person you are. I see the kind of game you're trying to play, but you are just that low, that uncool, that like dishonest that you don't deserve your position. You don't deserve that kind of power over the written word. And
Yeah.
so for a major news outlet to play stuff like that, and I think WAPO also, Washington Post also put in something as well that was somehow chafing recently as well.
Yeah, it
And
was about how to, oh, I can pull it up for you right now, but basically the implication was how dare Asians ask you to remove your shoes? But it was like how to avoid having that conversation, or why do we have to remove our shoes was the implication. I mean, and again, I'm going to post that here so people can see those articles. And I mean it's just, yeah. I got irritated in that too, because I was kind of like, oh, okay, well, one, it's just freaking clean, like to not wear your shoes in the house. But it's just, it also was a cultural attack, right? And here's
yeah,
the thing: if we do not get upset about it, then it's a problem, right? Because we finally decided to speak out about things, there are things that are changing. There are states that have included Asian American history now so kids can learn, right? There are things that are happening because we're not just saying, well, they didn't mean that. Right. So on one hand, I am not about flipping out every time someone like kind of offends me or says something and didn't mean to. I get the difference, right? I'm not that sensitive, but at the same time, if I didn't react and if I didn't feel what I felt, I wouldn't also be taking action, right? Because now things are in motion. There's movements happening because we're just not going to take it anymore. And I think it's an important thing. And I think thank you to all of our athletes of color. Like our BIPOC athletes are killing it out there, and we are really proud. We're proud of all of our athletes, but like it's just frustrating that that has to get pointed out all the time. And it has been an amazing day for the Asian Americans in the Olympics in this last week, and we're super proud as Asian Americans. And we feel that pride, and I don't think that's a negative thing. I think we should celebrate it.
hmm I certainly do. I think that like there's a kind of, again, a semantic here, right? Like there's being sensitive in the sense that like we that word is often used as if to connote you're hypersensitive or you're overreacting to a
Yes.
stimulus. Whereas I think the reality is that a lot of times people are being so reckless or rude or disconnected from their own emotions or their own agendas that when people who are more aware of those tones, of those undertones, call them out on it, their knee-jerk defense is to label that other person who did call them out on it as being sensitive or hypersensitive or oversensitive or too sensitive or whatever the word is. So we need to understand that there's a big difference between being aware of what's going on, being educated as far as like the implications of a word, and especially on the social context of when those words are used. Like, let's call it what it is. Right now, the United States is not the most stable it's been, especially during our lifetime.
Mhm.
And society is a little bit, I mean, especially in urban America, society is a little bit more dangerous than it's been in a long, long time. So for celebrities, for anyone who's got the national spotlight, certainly for anyone in the media to be careless or reckless or inflammatory with their words, while it might be great for their clicks, because like that WAPO article talking about, something they're going to keep their shoes on in our shoeless house. I understand that like a lot of that was just trying to like stir the pot so that people who felt outraged would click on it and read it and then they get all worked up and then share it. Again, the more clicks, the more times we spread that article, the more times we post that article, it's really just feeding into their ad dollars. So if we shut that kind of thing down, rather than getting more kind of upset about it and spreading it and highlighting it and drawing more eyes to it, then it dies on the vine. And then if we can, instead of like sharing it to our audiences, shut it down and also send feedback directly to, the executive board, on a more national level, as well as a grassroots level, saying that this
Mhm.
was not cool. Do
Yeah.
not do this again. And we will start, like, we who are in positions to pull our ad dollars will pull our ad dollars. Then we have a little bit more leverage.
Mhm.
And I think we as a society have gotten really, I think Mark Manson had a term for it, something like outrage porn. We've gotten so good at identifying things that are uncool, that are outrageous, that are deleterious and getting worked up over it. But our our forms of intervention are still uneducated, and we need to be able to educate ourselves on ways like to be able to do what you are, the kind of super useful, super precious work that you are doing to forward Asian American history, to make people understand what is really relevant and how important that is.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And while you were speaking, I just remembered the Washington Post thing was like, oh, the solution to ask when people ask about removing your shoes, get a doormat. It was the tone of it was super, super condescending. But yeah, that was it. That was the punchline was get a doormat. So before we wrap up here, I wanted to point out my bookshelf behind me because this is a gift from you, as a matter of fact. And your generosity knows no bounds. And I'm learning to graciously accept that generosity and just be grateful to your support and for just not just your, support, but your friendship. And you have been like an unbelievable force in helping uplift me and help me do the work that I'm doing. So I really appreciate you. And I love my bookshelf. And it makes a nicer backdrop for my podcast. So listeners who have no idea what I'm talking about, you can see this on YouTube and you can see my spiffy bookshelf from Dr. Mark Cheng.
Mimi's being far too kind and far too generous here, but like really, I think a lot of it came about because of discussions that you and I have, because we are seen. Let's be honest. It's very Asian American of us to kind of like play low and like duck our heads and fly under the radar. But we both operate and we both have grown up in a lot of ways, with eyes on us, doing what we do in our different fields. And there are people out there who have benefited from the stuff that we do and they want to support. And sometimes they can't be there. Like I can't be there in Orlando to hang out, to, vibe with you at times when something's bothering you. You certainly can't be here in LA with me, like at times when I'm just like, or this thing's pissing me off or whatever. So like the little things that we can do to show support to each other, whether it's you and me, whether it's us and our other friends, whether it's whoever, right? Like when we have fans that have means to allow them the chance to support us, um, and no matter how big or how small that is, it's meaningful for them as well as it is rewarding for us. So I think that's an important lesson, that you helped me understand when it came to volunteering. So I'm not saying this to just hit the reverse button on you, but really, like, for those of you listeners out there who aren't familiar with what I'm talking about, Mimi had a line, I think it was actually in one of her social media posts, that rocked my world. She said, allow people to volunteer at whatever level they're comfortable. So whether that is cold calling, great. Whether it's just doing Google searches and giving you relevant, like filtering out all the information to be able to identify, okay, these are the actionable things that I need to do, and giving you a short list, that's also useful. Like, it is anything that takes effort and time off your plate, and anything that takes like actionables off your plate so that they can handle it, and freeing up more time and bandwidth for you, is clutch. So I gotta really express my appreciation to you for like helping me realize that I was trying to hold on to too much. And so like I'm able to be way more productive now because of that. So thank you.
Oh, we'll just go back and forth gratitude here. So we will table this, and hopefully you'll come back and talk to me again soon. There's always stuff for you and I to talk about, but I'm really grateful to you for allowing me to vent for an hour about the Olympics and, gush over the Olympics at the same time. It's like a double-edged sword right now, the Olympics for me, but I appreciate you taking time to have this conversation with me.
Honored as always. Thank you.
All right. Until next time. Bye. That's all for today's episode. Thanks for listening to the Sifu Mimi Chan Show. Please subscribe and rate my podcast on your platform of choice and leave a review. You can become a patron of the show at patreon.com/SifuMimiChan to help keep this podcast going. Follow me and interact on social media at Sifu Mimi Chan on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook.